I took my son for a quiet day in the park, but this woman appeared staring at us as if we were doing something wrong. Within minutes, she started complaining that this space wasn't for him. Before I could react, she pulled out pepper spray and threw it in my son's face. He cried out in pain while she said she was only protecting herself. There was so much confusion that the police had to be called, and then things got even worse. It was supposed to be a peaceful day. One of those simple but special moments where all I wanted was to see my son smiling as he felt the wind on his face. The park was our refuge, a place where he could get out of the house, breathe fresh air, and feel the sun on his skin. But that day, reality reminded me in the worst possible way that there is always someone willing to spoil any peace. My name is Keisha Williams, and my son Jamal is the light of my life. That morning, we arrived early at Lakeside Park. The sky was clear, and the smell of cut grass made the atmosphere even more pleasant. Jamal was excited, as he always was when we went out. He never let his wheelchair limit his joy. For him, everything was a great adventure. The birds flying, the dogs running, the children playing. Just being there was a reason to smile. I pushed his chair to a pleasant spot near some trees where he could feel the cooling shade without losing sight of the park. He soon started pointing at a squirrel climbing a branch, laughing as if it were the most incredible thing in the world. I stood there just watching, keeping that moment with me, because I knew it was precious. But then she appeared. It was subtle at first, that uncomfortable feeling that someone was staring at you. At first, I thought it was all in my head, but when I looked away, there she was, a white woman overdressed for someone who was just taking a walk in the park. The kind of person who exudes superiority just by the way she moves. She was standing still, looking directly at us, as if she was evaluating something. Her gaze wasn't one of curiosity or simple distraction. It was the judgmental look of someone who has already decided that something is wrong. I tried to ignore it. It wouldn't be the first time I'd felt that kind of look on us. But the woman, I would later learn her name was Karen Benson, didn't turn away. She just stood there, staring, as if she was trying to understand why we were there. Not far from us, a man sat on a park bench, seemingly engrossed in his laptop. He glanced up occasionally, his attention divided between his work and the unfolding scene. I noticed him notice us, and then noticed Karen staring. For a moment, our eyes met, but he quickly looked away, returning to his screen. I felt a flicker of disappointment. Just another bystander who wouldn't get involved. Jamal, who was too smart for his age, noticed the woman staring. He looked at me, then at her, with a confused expression. He didn't ask anything, but I knew that look well. It was the look of someone who sensed that something was wrong, but couldn't yet put it into words. I took a deep breath. My instinct told me that ignoring her would be the best course of action. People like that always exist, and I wasn't going to let them ruin our moment. But Karen didn't just stare. She started walking towards us, her steps firm, determined, like someone who already had a very clear purpose. And deep down, I already knew what was coming. It was always the same phrases, the same old arguments disguised as concern. The man on the bench looked up again. This time, he set his laptop aside and watched more intently. He pulled out his phone, and for a moment, I thought he might be calling for help. Instead, he appeared to be recording. Great. Our harassment would become someone's social media content. Karen stopped near us, looked at me for a moment, and then at Jamal. Her gaze lingered on him, as if she were analyzing every detail. Then, without any context, without any introduction, she let loose. What is he doing here? It wasn't an innocent question. It wasn't curiosity. It was an accusation in disguise. I laughed dry, because it was always like that. Some people just couldn't accept that we existed, that we were entitled to the same spaces as them. We're enjoying the day, I replied, without patience for beating around the bush. She frowned, clearly unhappy with my response. But this is no place for him. The sentence hung in the air for a moment. I had to hold back, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I already knew that nothing I said would change this woman's mind. People like that don't want to learn. They don't want to understand. They want to impose. Jamal didn't understand the weight of that sentence. To him, it was just a confused adult talking nonsense. But I knew it wasn't just about him being in a wheelchair. It was about him, about the color of his skin, about the fact that for her, there were spaces that weren't for him. I could have argued. I could have shouted. I could have told her how disgusting that mentality was. But honestly, Jamal deserved more than that. He deserved a day without fights. Oh, of course, I replied with a sarcastic smile. Because parks now have a list of who can and can't enter. right? The man on the bench stood up. He was tall, maybe in his 30s, with olive skin and dark hair pulled back in a short ponytail. He approached us slowly, his phone still recording. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. Karen crossed her arms, unperturbed. "I don't think you understand. It's not about the park. It's about him." She said him, in a way that made me want to vomit. I felt my blood boil. All I wanted was a quiet day. A day when I wouldn't have to remember that Jamal would have to face people like that for the rest of his life. But before I could react, she did something I never imagined anyone would have the courage to do. And that's when everything fell apart. If there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that there's always a specific type of person who thinks they have the authority to decide where others can be. Karen was exactly that type. She wasn't there to argue, to understand, or even to pretend she was right. She was there to impose, and what's worse, she truly believed she was right. After her sentence, my body tensed up. I'd already dealt with a lot of ignorance, crossed eyes, and comments disguised as concern, but at that moment, I sensed that this woman wasn't just going to stop at words. There was something in the way she looked at me, in the contempt in her voice, that made me realize that this was far from over. My innocent son continued to smile, not understanding the weight of the situation. He just watched, waiting for me to say something, to follow the usual script in which the adults sort everything out while the children go back to playing. I wanted to follow that script. I wanted to just ignore it, turn around, and get on with our day. But Karen wasn't going to allow that. The man with the phone, who I would later learn was Michael Rivera, stepped closer. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "I think you should move along. They're not bothering anyone." Karen shot him a venomous look. "Stay out of this. You don't understand what's happening here." She took a step forward, now closer to us than before. Her body was rigid, her eyes fixed on Jamal as if she was facing something that shouldn't be there. "You can't just bring him anywhere and expect everyone to accept it." Her sentence came with a tone that made me want to laugh nervously. "Excuse me." Michael's voice hardened. "Accept what exactly? A child enjoying a public park? This is America," Karen snapped. "I have a right to feel safe in my community." "Safe from what?" I demanded, my patience evaporating. "A 10-year-old boy. Since when did my son's existence need the acceptance of a stranger?" I remained silent for a few seconds because I was processing just how far this woman would go. And she, as if she thought she had won the argument, continued. "There are more appropriate places for him, places that suit him better." Ah, so now it was about matching. Before I could reply, Karen did something I hadn't expected. She reached into her handbag and, in one swift movement, pulled out a black bottle and squeezed the spray directly onto Jamal's face. For a second, my brain didn't process what had just happened. I heard the sound of the spray being released, smelled the strong odor in the air, and suddenly Jamal screamed, a loud, desperate scream that cut through the silence of the park. He put his hands to his face, trying to cover his eyes, while Karen backed away, still holding the bottle as if she were defending herself against some imaginary attack. "What the hell?" Michael shouted, his phone still recording. "She just pepper sprayed a child." I froze, my muscles locked up, the world around me blurred. All I could hear was Jamal crying and see Karen standing there, holding the spray bottle as if she were proud of what she had done. My first reaction was to bend down, to hold Jamal, trying to understand what was happening. But the strong smell burned the air. Pepper spray. This woman had thrown pepper spray in the face of a wheelchair-bound child. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I held Jamal in my arms, trying to calm him down as he cried, his face red, his tears flowing uncontrollably. His despair made my heart break. And Karen? She didn't show a shred of regret. She stood there, watching the scene as if she had done the right thing, as if she had just solved a problem. "I only defended myself," she said, her voice firm, as if she were justifying something completely normal. He was staring at me. I felt threatened. Threatened? A grown woman against a child in a wheelchair? I wanted to push her. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip that spray out of her hand and make her feel what Jamal was feeling. But instead, my priority was to hold on to my son and try to mitigate the damage this bastard had done. Michael was on his phone, apparently calling 911. "Yes, I need police and an ambulance at Lakeside Park. A woman just pepper sprayed a disabled child. I have the whole thing on video." The people around us finally started to react. Until that moment, they had just looked on from afar, as if we were just arguing, as if it was nothing more than a silly disagreement. But now, people were stopping, whispering, grabbing their cell phones, trying to understand what the hell had just happened. Someone ran up to me, an older woman with a worried expression, asking if I needed help. Someone shouted, "What have you done?" in the direction of Karen, but she simply wouldn't budge. And then came the most revolting moment of all. She took out her cell phone and started dialing a number. "I'm going to call the police," she said with the cleanest face in the world. It was self-defense. My brain froze. She had assaulted my son, and now she wanted to play the victim. And at that moment, I knew that this story was far from over. Jamal was still crying, his face red, his eyes closed, as I desperately tried to relieve the sting caused by the pepper spray. The park, once peaceful, now looked like a scene of chaos. Some people had approached, outraged by what they had just witnessed, while others just looked on from afar, unsure whether to get involved. Michael stepped between Karen and us, his phone still recording. "Put down the spray," he demanded. "The police are coming, and they'll see everything you did. Back away from me." Karen screeched, waving the pepper spray threateningly. "I'll use this on you too." And Karen? She was standing, holding her cell phone as if she were making the most legitimate of calls to the police. She spoke with a calm that disgusted me, as if she were the victim of the situation, as if she were reporting a robbery or an assault. "Yes, I'm in the park. A boy tried to attack me, and I had to defend myself. Yes, he's big, I got scared. He's in a wheelchair, but he acted threateningly." I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip that phone out of her hand and rub the truth in the face of whoever was on the other end of the line. But I knew how this game worked. I'd seen this script before. She wanted to turn the tables. She wanted to be the victim. She wanted the authorities to arrive believing that she was just protecting herself from a threat. And the worst thing? I knew it could work. Because in the world we live in, the word of a well-dressed white woman crying on the phone is always worth more than the truth of a black mother holding her child in despair. I tried to concentrate on Jamal. Some people had mobilized to help. One woman brought water. Another tried to find something to clean his face without making it worse. But the burning was too strong, and he continued to sob, confused, his body shaking. Then the siren sounded. The police arrived quickly, as they do when the caller has the right skin tone. Two policemen got out of the car and headed straight for Karen. Of course, she was the one who had called, after all. Karen, who until then had been feigning an air of fragility, changed her posture on the spot. Her face lit up with relief, and she ran towards the officers as if she were a damsel rescued from kidnapping. Thank God, I felt so threatened. He and his mother came here and started acting aggressively towards me. I had no choice. I just defended myself. She was still holding the damn pepper spray in her hand, the bottle she had used on Jamal's face. And it was at that moment that I realized, if I didn't speak first, my voice wouldn't be heard. Michael stepped forward. "Officers, I'm Michael Rivera, attorney with the Civil Liberties Foundation. I recorded this entire incident. This woman," he pointed at Karen, "approached this family unprovoked and pepper sprayed a disabled child without any justification." Karen's face contorted with shock. "He's lying. They were threatening me." "It's all on video," Michael replied calmly, holding up his phone. Every second, from the moment she approached them with her racist comments to when she assaulted the child. I held Jamal tightly and stood up, my heart racing. Before the police could pay any more attention to Karen, I approached without hesitation. She threw pepper spray in my son's face for no reason. "Everyone here for proof." The policeman looked at me, then at Jamal, who was still sobbing, and for a moment, they seemed to hesitate. I don't think they expected to see a small, visibly injured child in a wheelchair. It didn't fit with the story they had just heard. One of them frowned and turned to Karen. "Can you explain what happened?" She didn't stutter. She didn't flinch. She just carried on with the theater. He kept staring at me in a very strange way. I felt he might do something to me. I've seen cases like this on TV. People who pretend to be innocent, but deep down are just waiting for the right moment to strike. Oh my God, she was really saying that. She was criminalizing a child in a wheelchair, turning Jamal into an invisible predator who only existed in her head. And that's when I saw, with my own eyes, the doubt creep onto the policemen's faces. Because in their world, it wasn't so absurd to think that a white, middle-class woman could be telling the truth. Despair rose in my throat. I knew that if I didn't take control of the situation at that moment, this story could take a very dangerous turn. "Officer," Michael interjected, his tone authoritative but calm. "Before you make any decisions, you should know that I've already uploaded this video to our secure cloud storage, and my colleagues at the foundation are reviewing it now. This is a clear case of assault against a minor, motivated by racial bias. One of the officers straightened slightly. Sir, we'll need a copy of that video. Of course, Michael nodded. But I want to be clear, this incident requires a proper investigation, not just taking statements at face value. There are cameras, I said, pointing to the posts around the park. There are cameras everywhere, and there are witnesses. Ask anyone here. Everyone saw what that woman did. Karen stiffened. She hadn't thought of that. She was so used to having her word accepted without question that she didn't realize that, this time, there was evidence against her. The policemen looked at each other. One of them started to look around and finally noticed the small group of people who had gathered. Some were recording, others were muttering among themselves indignantly. It wasn't one word against the other. She couldn't just get away with it. The second policeman turned to her. Did you use pepper spray on him? She hesitated. For the first time, she hesitated. It was reflex. Her voice was less firm now. I got scared, startled. The policeman crossed his arms, waiting. She turned red. She couldn't keep up the lie any longer. And I saw the fear in her eyes. The tables were turning. But it wasn't over yet. Because even in the face of all this, even with the cameras, the witnesses, and my word against hers, the final decision was still in the hands of the police. And I knew that, depending on what they decided to do, Karen could still get away with it. An older woman from the crowd stepped forward. I saw everything. That poor boy wasn't doing anything. She came over and started saying he didn't belong here. Another voice chimed in. She's lying about feeling threatened. The kid was just watching squirrels. But then another voice rose from the crowd. We don't know what happened before they started filming. Maybe she did feel threatened. By a child in a wheelchair, someone shot back incredulously. All I'm saying is, we don't have the full story, the first voice insisted. The crowd was dividing, and I could feel the momentum shifting. Some were defending Karen, suggesting that maybe, somehow, she had a reason. The silence at that moment was almost deafening. Jamal was still crying softly, his breathing shaky with sobs. My heart was pounding in my chest, but not from fear. It was anger. Anger that burned inside, that made me want to scream, to demand that Karen pay for what she had done. But I knew that none of that would do any good. The only thing that mattered now was how those policemen were going to react. Karen was still standing there, holding the pepper spray as if she was still ready to use it. But now, she no longer had that air of superiority. Her posture was more tense, her eyes restless. She was realizing that the story she had invented was no longer sticking. The first policeman looked at the crowd that had formed around them. Some people were discreetly recording with their cell phones, and others were simply watching, waiting for the outcome. I saw when he realized that he couldn't just ignore it. He looked at his partner and muttered something low, and then they both approached Karen. Do you have any real justification for using pepper spray on a child? She cringed a little, held her bag tightly, and tried to maintain her pose. I felt threatened. He was looking at me strangely. I acted on instinct. The policeman sighed. I could see on his face that even he didn't believe that excuse anymore. There are cameras in the park, ma'am. We'll check the footage. If we confirm that you attacked this child for no reason, it could be considered assault. That word made Karen turn pale. Assault. Until that moment, I think she still thought she could get away with it, that her role as a victim would be enough to turn the tide. But now, it was becoming clear that wasn't going to happen. She began to gesture, trying to look indignant. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just got scared. I would never do something like that on purpose. I clenched my teeth. It wasn't enough what she'd done. Now she wanted to pretend to be sorry. The policeman looked at me. Do you want to press charges? I felt the weight of that question because I knew what it meant. If I said yes, it wouldn't end there. It would turn into a lawsuit. I'd have to deal with more bureaucracy, more emotional distress. Jamal would have to relive it again and again. But if I said no, Karen would get out of there with no real consequences. Maybe she'd get a scolding, maybe she'd be a little embarrassed, but at the end of the day, she'd go home, sleep peacefully, and the next day, she'd probably get on with her life as if nothing had happened. And what about me? I'd carry that rebellion forever. I looked at Jamal. He was still recovering, but now he was looking at me expectantly. He wanted to know what was going to happen to Karen. He wanted to know if what she had done was allowed. I couldn't give him the feeling that the world always protects people like that. Yes, I want to press charges. Karen's eyes widened, as if that were absurd. But I told you it was a mistake. You can't do that. Michael stepped forward. Actually, she absolutely can. And as a witness, I'll be providing my testimony as well. What you did was assault, plain and simple. The policeman ignored Karen's protests and took out a notepad. Ma'am, I need your identity card. You'll be taken to give explanations. She began to shake her head, her eyes filling with forced tears. This isn't fair. I only tried to protect myself. Now I'm the one being treated like a criminal. The irony of it made me laugh. Exactly what she tried to do to me and Jamal. The crowd began to murmur, and some people even let out discreet applause when they saw that she was finally being held accountable. But suddenly, Karen's demeanor changed. Her tears dried instantly, and a cold smile spread across her face. Do you have any idea who my husband is? She asked, her voice dripping with newfound confidence. Robert Benson, the city councilman. I'd like to make my phone call now. The officers exchanged glances. I saw a flicker of hesitation cross their faces. Michael's jaw tightened. That's irrelevant, he said firmly. The law applies equally to everyone, regardless of who their spouse might be. We'll see about that, Karen replied, her smile widening. We'll certainly see about that. The police escorted her to the car, and she was still protesting, still whimpering, still trying to justify herself. But now no one was listening. When I finally saw her being put in the car, I felt a weight come off my chest. But I knew it wasn't the end yet. The system doesn't always favor those on the right side. And I would still have to fight to ensure that Karen really was held accountable. But at least in that moment, Jamal saw that what she did had consequences. And that, for me, was a victory. Seeing Karen being put into the car should have brought me immediate relief. But to be honest, I couldn't feel anything but exhaustion. The whole scene seemed surreal. How had a simple trip to the park turned into an episode of pure insanity? I looked at Jamal, who was still rubbing his eyes, trying to relieve the sting, and felt a mixture of sadness and anger. He didn't deserve to go through that. No child did. I had already learned the hard way that certain people never see black children as just children. They always find a way to make them a threat, to say that they don't belong in certain places. Michael approached us, his phone now tucked away. I'm sorry you had to go through that, he said quietly. I work with cases like this, but it's always different when you witness it firsthand. Thank you for stepping in, I replied. And for recording. I almost didn't, he admitted, looking ashamed. At first, I thought it was just an argument that would blow over. I'm glad I did, though. The park gradually began to return to normal. Some people still looked in our direction, some with empathy, others with the morbid curiosity of someone witnessing a chaotic scene. A couple approached me to ask if I needed anything, if they wanted me to call an ambulance. But I thanked them and said I was already taking care of him. An older woman who had been watching the whole thing closely shook her head and muttered, I've never seen anything so absurd in all my life. Neither have I responded. But at the same time, I've seen too many situations to be completely surprised. The policeman came back to me after putting Karen in the car. One of them handed me a card with some information on it and said that I would soon be called to give a statement. They would analyze the images from the security cameras and make a report on the case. If you need anything, this is my direct contact, said the policeman. And for a moment, I thought he looked really uncomfortable with everything that had happened. Maybe he wasn't used to dealing with this kind of thing. Or maybe he had children and was wondering how he would feel if it was him. I took the card, put it in my pocket, and nodded. Does she already have a record? The question slipped out before I could think. I don't know why, but I wondered if Karen had ever caused trouble before. The policeman hesitated for a second. That will be looked into, too. In other words, even if she had done something like this before, no one was going to admit it to me right then and there. Michael handed me his card as well. I'd like to follow up with you, if that's okay. The Civil Liberties Foundation provides legal support in cases like this. I nodded, grateful but exhausted. As soon as they left, I bent down next to Jamal and held his hands. Are you feeling better? He nodded, slow, but his gaze was still lost, as if he was trying to understand everything that had happened. Why did she do that? The question hit me like a punch. Because deep down, there was no simple answer. You couldn't say it was a mistake because it wasn't. You couldn't say it was an isolated case because it wasn't either. The truth is that Karen took one look at him and decided that he shouldn't be there. Not because of anything he'd done, but for who he was. I took a deep breath and squeezed his hand. Because some people think they can choose who belongs in certain places, but that doesn't mean they're right. He looked at me for a moment, absorbing my words, and then nodded. He didn't ask any more questions. I think he somehow already knew that this wouldn't be the last time he'd face something like this. We went home, and I spent the rest of the day looking after him, making sure his eyes were better, trying to bring some comfort to a situation that should never have happened. The next few days were strange. I received a few calls to confirm my statement, spent time explaining to friends and family what had happened. And of course, there were those who tried to minimize the situation. Maybe she really did get scared? Are you sure she did it out of spite? The world is very sensitive these days. I just smiled and changed the subject. I wasn't going to waste my energy explaining the obvious to people who didn't want to see it. The story had made the local news, and to my surprise, it had gone viral online. Michael's video had been shared thousands of times, sparking fierce debates. Some comments were supportive, expressing outrage at what Karen had done. Others were skeptical, suggesting that maybe she really had felt threatened or that I was using the race card to gain sympathy. The most surprising twist came a week later. Karen's husband, Councilman Benson, held a press conference. I expected him to defend his wife, to try to spin the story. Instead, he apologized publicly to us, to the community, and to everyone who was hurt by this incident. He announced that Karen was seeking psychological help for her anxiety and paranoia, and that they would be making a substantial donation to organizations supporting disabled children of color. It was a calculated political move, of course, but it was also, in its way, an admission of guilt. As for Karen, I found out sometime later that she didn't stay in jail, of course. She wasn't there long. She spent a few hours explaining herself, had to pay a fine, and probably received a formal scolding before being sent home. For the system, it was just another incident. But for me and Jamal, it was a mark, a reminder that not even a day in the park is free of people like her. I'd like to say that it didn't affect us, that we moved on as if nothing had happened. But that would be a lie. For weeks, every time we went out, I noticed how Jamal looked around more than before, how he seemed more aware of who was around. He still smiled, he still had fun, but now there was something different in his eyes. And what about me? I carried on doing what I've always done, protecting my son, teaching him not to put his head down, but above all, making sure that no woman like Karen would ever make us feel that we didn't belong anywhere we wanted to be. A month after the incident, we returned to that same park. It was Michael's suggestion, a way to reclaim the space, to not let fear win. Jamal was nervous at first, but once we were there, once he saw the squirrels again and felt the sun on his face, the joy returned to his eyes. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. Have you ever met someone who thought they had the right to decide who can and can't be in a place? Let me know in the comments, because unfortunately, people like that are everywhere. And if you like this story and want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and like it because it helps a lot. Do you want to see more unbelievable stories? Then click on the card and come marathon. See you in the next video.